Today we have Erica Marchand, and her topic, as you can see, is love, sex, and culture.
So I will not spend a whole lot of time introducing myself because I think Douglas did a really nice job. I'm really happy to be here presenting today, and I hope that you guys find this topic as interesting as I do. So what I'll be talking about, obviously, is therapy with interracial couples, and I'll talk a little bit more about why this is a topic of interest to me. But what I'm hoping to cover today, and I might go through some of these a bit more briefly, but I think you have slides, handouts of all the slides. So if there's anything that I don't cover in depth, you can always ask me at the end, or you'll have all the information in your handout. So what I want to get through today is I want to hear from all of you just briefly, some quick introductions, who you are, who you work with, things like that. We'll talk about the aims of the talk today. I'll go through some definitions because I think it's always helpful to clarify how I'm using terms when we're talking about stuff like culture and race and things like that. We'll talk about interracial couples, some of the stats on prevalence, some of the history in this country anyway, and then some of the relationship issues that you might see coming up in your practice. And then we'll talk about specifically some clinical tools. And then I'm really aiming to save time at the end for discussion and Q&A, because I know this is a topic that people tend to want to talk about and have ideas about and questions about, so I really am going to aim to leave that space at the end. So I'll introduce myself a little bit. This picture looks so big. So a lot of people in the past, and you guys might be wondering too, so I just want to bring a little bit of personal into it. A lot of people have asked me in the past, are you biracial, or are your parents, interracial? And so I just want to give a bit of context on me. So I'm not actually biracial. This is my family, minus my sister, who's in the next slide, my brother, my dad, and my mom, whose face unfortunately is half off of the frame, but so you get a sense, this is what we look like, and I'll show you. This is my sister, who wasn't in the last picture, and my two nieces, and there's my dad again. So my family is not biracial per se, but we're from Louisiana, so we come from Creole people who are a mix of a lot of interracial mixing over the generations. So that's sort of where I come from, and is part of the reason that I'm interested in, yeah, she's giving rabbiters. Part of the reason that I'm interested in this. My own relationship, I am in an interracial relationship. This is my partner, John, and me, looking sunburned. We've been together for about almost 14 years, which is crazy, a long time. So this is part of the context, the personal context for some of my interest in these issues. And I will say my personal experience, I'll talk about it some in this talk, but it has definitely informed how I think about interracial relationships and what I think is important to talk about and to consider. So in terms of our talk today, I really want to give you some overview on the prevalence of interracial couples. You're really likely to see them if you're a couples therapist, and you haven't already if you're in California. Talk about some of the historical and current context that influences interracial couples in particular, and some of the issues that come up from history and current context as well. We'll talk about self-awareness and cultural responsiveness in terms of clinical tools, and then some specific tools for working with interracial couples. So the agreements part of this, I realized for this talk, we're going to be talking about a lot of things that people don't usually talk about in public. So we're going to definitely talk about race, probably going to talk about religion a little bit. We're going to talk about politics and difficult parts of history. So
we're going to talk about money, too.
We are going to talk about money. Yes. 5 difficult, uncomfortable things. Now, I know we're all therapists, and we all have some level of understanding that, obviously things aren't always comfortable, but so I'm just going to put it out there at the outset and say, some of this might feel awkward or uncomfortable, or might bring up questions or present things that are different than your experience has been, or bring up new ideas or things like that. I would just ask everybody to take kind of an open stance, open and curious. That's the word that I like to use a lot. Take a curious stance, see what fits with your experience, see what doesn't. Have a willingness to be a bit uncomfortable, as I will be as well sometimes, and we'll just sort of sit with that and get through it, and I think it'll lead to some rich discussion at the end. feel free to definitely share your reactions honestly and respectfully. I think sometimes the discussion that gets generated is sometimes the most insightful part of talking about issues like this. And I will reserve the right to hold comments till the end as needed, because I do want to get through a bulk of the presentation, and I know it's something that we could talk about for a long time. So if I do ask us to hold comments at some point, don't take it personally. It's just in the interest of time. Sound okay? Okay. All right, so I'm going to tell you what I'm about to tell you right at the beginning, so you'll know, so you'll be able to follow the thread that we're going through. The main thing here, and I put this slide at the beginning because by the time I got to the end of writing the talk, I realized it sounds, it can sound a bit problem focused because I'm talking about therapy with people. But I want to say at the outset that I don't want to paint interracial relationships as problematic or as, fraught with more problems than other relationships at all. I think, people have been getting together across racial borders for as long as people have encountered each other across racial borders. And it's, the reasons that people get together interracially are the same reasons that people get together any other, time. It's because they're attracted to each other and they develop love for each other and they want, and they see something in each other that wants to make them stay together. So I don't want to lose that part. So that is the overview of this talk, even though we will talk about problems that can arise. Interracial relationships are really common, as we'll talk about. Couples have unique strengths, but as we'll talk about in this talk, also really unique challenges that therapists can really help with if we address it in the right way. So that's the overview of where we're going with this today. I'll just say this briefly. There's a lot of terms that people use for interracial couples. People say intercultural, people say interethnic, people might say multi-racial or ethnic or cultural. I'm using interracial just because it's the most common term that's out there and I wanted it to be recognizable to people who read the title. I don't know that race is the most precise term for what we're talking about, and I won't really get into the definitions, but I just wanted to put that out there. It was an intentional choice to say interracial because I wanted it to be recognizable. I will say also about this talk that a lot of the research that's out there is based on US couples, so that's going to be one of the boundaries that we're going to establish here. There's not enough time or resources to talk about a lot of the interracial relationships in international contexts. Most of the research is on heterosexual couples, but I have tried to bring in sources that talk about LGBT couples and some of the ways that interracial relationships interact with different types of couples. And then finally, most of the research is on married couples, traditionally married couples, and there's not a lot on couples who are either committed but unmarried or people who are dating, so just know that in advance. All right, so let's talk some statistics. So in the US in 2008, there was this really nice study done by the Pew Research Center called Marrying Out, and the citation is in the references if you want to read the whole thing. But it was a study that was really focused on, the experiences and the prevalence and the attitudes about interracial couples in the United States. And so in 2008, the stat was that 8% of all married couples were interracial, but they also did a really interesting thing. They looked at new marriages. They defined that as people who had gotten married within the last year, which is kind of it's a better indicator of what's happening now versus just an average of overall. So while 8% overall were interracial, of the new couples, of the new marriages, almost 15% were interracial marriages. And in California, that's even higher. It's 22% of new marriages in 2008 were among interracial couples. And you can imagine there's a lot of reasons for that number being higher in California. It's really diverse. There's a relatively liberal view here, as well as other reasons that you could think of. But the point is, if you're a therapist in California who sees couples, you're very likely to come across an interracial couple in your practice at some point. That's over a fifth of people. I'm not going to go through the stats in a lot of detail. I will say most interracial marriages involve one white spouse, and I think that's important for some of the racial issues that we'll talk about. And again, I'm not going to go through the stats in a ton of detail, but you can read them in your slides. So let's talk a little bit about the history, and we'll get into this a little bit more. And I think history, even though things have changed a lot racially since several generations ago, I think the history still impacts the clients that we see today, for sure. We'll talk about how that is. So obviously, like we talked about earlier, interracial couplings have been happening anywhere that people have encountered each other. Some of the examples that you can think of in the US, current examples, you know, immigration and migration, people come from lots of different places all here to the US and meet each other. And obviously there are some interracial relationships that come from that. When you think historically, you can think about relationships, non-consensual or consensual, who knows, that happened in some of the more difficult times of human history, like things that happened with war and occupation, the relationships that happened during slavery and colonization in the US and around the world. A lot of those relationships we think about as non-consensual, where the group of people with the more power, or the invading group, or the winning group, frequently would have non-consensual sex, let's say, with the women of the place who either lost out or was being colonized or had less power. And that's not something we talk about very often, but certainly for the groups that have been involved in that, there is a cultural memory of those things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the talk. The point of this, and I'm not going to go a lot into the history because, again, there's not that much time, but the point is that there's a really complex history of interracial interactions that leads us to where we are today. And people carry that with them through the generations, and we have to think about it. So a little bit more about the history in the US. So until 1967, there were laws that outlawed interracial marriage in 42 states. So there was a really strong negative public opinion and strong legal opinion against this. In 1967, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional to make interracial marriage illegal. And so the laws were not able to be enforced as strongly as they had been before. But interestingly, you know how this works with the federal government and the state governments, not all the states agreed. And so you can see in 2000, in the year 2000, Alabama was the last state to repeal its state anti-miscegenation law. And miscegenation is just sort of a pejorative term for interracial marriage. And against 41% voter opposition, people who voted in that. Right? So it's surprising to us to think that, to hear that, but I think it does show the real, still there's a lot of variation in people's attitudes in the US about interracial relationships, even though we've come a long way, certainly. Another important piece to think about in US history in terms of this is sexual relationships that occurred during colonization and slavery. So, like, the way that my family got to look the way that we do was because of some of these relationships. You know, certainly slave owners would have non-consensual sex, maybe sometimes consensual sex with their female slaves, that, you know, children were produced, and over generations and over time, people, you know, there came to be a lot of mixing of blood, but also a lot of, as you can imagine, bad feelings and cultural memory of those types of traumas that happened over and over and over again. And it's very far behind us. It feels very far behind us now. But certainly those relationships and the way that those things unfolded still color how people think about interracial relationships, interracial sex. We can't ignore the sort of taint of the past that happens sometimes when thinking about these things. In Louisiana, which is where my family is from, more recently there was a system that not a lot of people know about. And so I say this predominantly to highlight the difference between the laws, the stated laws that were in place, and what actually happened. Because I think that dichotomy and that ambivalence that we have had as a culture about interracial relationships is really important. So the law said, you know, you can't do this. But it happened in a de facto way, non-consensually. In Louisiana, there was this really interesting interesting, I don't know if that's the right word, system called plaçage. Plaçage is a French word that means to be placed somewhere, whereby wealthy white men were able to have sort of in plain sight of society mistresses of color, and could have whole families with these other women, and put them up in homes and had them as sort of a separate spouse, even if they later married or even if they were married at the time. It was very public. These were contractual relationships where the women in question wrote up a contract like, okay, if I'm going to be your mistress, I'm going to get a house and or freedom for my family and or education for my kids, blah blah blah. So it was very contractual. It's described as something that was not legal. It was explicitly against the codes of the time, but it happened, and it happened in plain sight, and everybody kind of knew about it. So it's there has, I think, for a long time in this country been a real dichotomy between what's stated as okay and then what's allowed to happen, and who benefits from what's allowed to happen too. That's another thing that we always think about. So that's just a brief bit of history. In terms of the attitudes toward interracial relationships, I think this is really interesting. So a Gallup poll in 1958, which I think is a good time to sort of assess this, because if I think about 58, my parents anyway were growing up, and my grandparents definitely were grown up and would have been exposed to these attitudes at the time. So in 58, 92% of white people in the northern and western states were opposed, who took this poll, 99% of southern whites, as you would expect in 1958. Now, our attitudes have changed a lot. In 2004, most people are, it's interesting, there's a, let me go into this in more detail actually, let me turn around. So this survey was about people's attitudes about having a family member, a close family member, a daughter, a son, marry someone of a different race. And so they asked the question generally, and then they asked the question by race. And I think the answers are pretty interesting and telling. So when they asked people, what about having a close family member marry a black person? Among white people, obviously attitudes have changed a lot. 22% in favor, 29% opposed. 49% ambivalent. Other categories, I don't know why they did this, but they measured attitudes among black people, white people, and then other. So we can only guess that means like everybody else. And so among other ethnic groups, 22% favored, 30% opposed, 49% were ambivalent. So it's like across the board, it's striking the similarity of the attitudes. Obviously, we've changed a lot. But obviously, there's still a significant number of people who wouldn't be comfortable with their family member marrying a black person. What about having a close family member marry a white person? So among black people, 38% said that'd be fine, 15% said no, 48% were ambivalent, and then among others, similar numbers. The piece that I think is really important for us to know now in our current context is that so many people are ambivalent. Because I think what we encounter so much less often is any sort of blatant opposition or blatant racism or really blatant, I don't like your partner because they're black or Latino or whatever. But a lot of people have mixed feelings. And we know as therapists, when people have mixed feelings about things that they haven't explored, all kinds of things can happen. Because we all want to think of ourselves, even if we are ambivalent, as good people. We certainly don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, and yet if we're not recognizing the other pieces of our ambivalence, they come out in weird ways. And so this is what we are often dealing with as therapists today, is the ambivalent piece of, I want to think it's okay, but really I have these other uncomfortable feelings and I don't know where to talk about that, and I don't know what to say about that. So that's the context of a lot of our clients right now. In terms of relationship issues, this is going to be really the meat of our talk here. So, like I said at the beginning, I don't want to miss the part about what's positive about interracial relationships. And as couples therapists, you guys know that, all couples bring into these things attraction and love and commitment and, desire for companionship and enrichment and social network and development of in interracial relationships in particular, development of a multicultural identity is something that a lot of people say that they get from the interaction with a partner from another culture and the family and the social network that go along with that. Experience of difference is a potentially positive piece of this. And by difference, I mean sometimes what is interesting or fun or attracts people initially to an interracial relationship is this idea of different. I read a lot of qualitative studies when I was preparing for this talk, and what people said oftentimes was, they were just so different. I was really curious, or they just looked so different from me. I wanted to know more. I was attracted. Or I really appreciate this part of their family or the way that they do things that is so different from mine. Like they're more relaxed, or they're more structured, or whatever. So a lot of the things that go along with interracial relationships are definitely potentially positive things. But since we're talking about therapy and what we might see in therapy, we're going to focus on the potentially difficult pieces. So we'll talk about stereotypes, social value or social location, the intersection of sexual orientation, gender, and class with race in interracial relationships, money, family, and a negative experience of difference and how people negotiate that. So let's jump right in. Stereotypes. So I will say that I had some really cool videos for you guys to watch, but since there's no internet, we can't watch them. I know. But I do encourage you to type in the link and go watch these on your own. They're really fascinating. When I was researching this, YouTube is actually a wealth of content, both sort of thoughtful and professional content like this one. Funny, but in a cringing way, like this one, and just everything in between, people giving their own opinions. So I think one of the most important things, one of the most difficult things that people come up against in interracial relationships is the idea of stereotypes. Because once you walk into a relationship with somebody who's different, it highlights your difference as well. So we all know that stereotypes exist, right? Like we all grew up in the US, we see them played out on TV, in the movies, on the news, every day, all the time. And we, as members of groups ourselves, like a lot of us are women here, we could probably name off like 5 stereotypes about women immediately without even thinking about it, right? And so people of groups who are stereotyped tend to know the stereotypes. They know their stereotypes. One of the, so how does this affect couples, right? So one of the interviews that I read was a white woman in a relationship with a black man, and the interviewer was asking, what's it like for you? And what do you come up against? What do you experience? And she said, it depends on who's around. So if I'm in a room with it depends on who I think the audience is. So if I'm thinking of it from white men's perspective, I fear that they think I'm kind of slutty, or that I am settling, or that I am, or that I lack judgment, right? Ouch. Mm-hmm. But she was really honest and really aware of these stereotypes that if we put ourselves in her shoes, we can sort of imagine feeling that way too. She said, if I'm around black women, I worry that they see me as, I worry that they're angry at me, that they see me as sort of stealing something that belongs to them. Or I worry that they, look down on me. And so she was really aware of a lot of the negative stereotypes. And the interviewer said, so how does that affect you? How does that affect you in your relationship, in your life? She said, I find myself sometimes closing in a little bit and becoming a little less outgoing. And because I'm trying really hard not to play into those stereotypes. So even in the confines of their relationship, even at home, she said, sometimes I'm really aware of not wanting to portray a certain image, so I don't do certain things. And so I think it's a really nice example of how something that's really socio-cultural, right, stereotypes, comes down to a very personal level and a very relational level. Another example, I wish I could show you this clip. I don't know where it came from. I think maybe it was an Arsenio Hall clip or something like that. It's called I Married a Black Woman. It's actually really funny, and I hate to say that, but it's funny, but it's terrible. So it's this clip of a white guy, it's like a young couple, a white guy and a black woman, and he comes in and he's like, hey, honey, have you seen my phone? And the black woman is super stereotypical. She's like, I don't know, have I seen your phone? And then goes through this whole thing where she's actually going through his phone because she's going through his contacts looking for names who sound black, and she's jealous, and she's like, who's Veronica? And he's like, it's just a coworker, and she's like, nope, delete. And it's really, it's funny, but you cringe while you're watching it because you know that this is such a stereotypical way that things, you know, are said to play out. And so, and I can say for myself as a black woman in a relationship with a white man, I feel very cautious and careful about, not so much anymore, but really a lot at the beginning, about how I'm perceived and how I'm presented in a way that is a little bit constricting, because, you know, if I do get mad, am I going to be perceived as an angry black woman? You know, if I do, early on in my relationship, I was a grad student and he was, or sometime in the middle of our relationship actually, I was a grad student and he was a lawyer and he had a job and I had a grad student salary, and we were long distance for some period of time. And so when I needed to travel to see him, I was really aware frequently of, you know, I don't want him to pay for my trip because I don't want to be perceived as just going out with him for his money or as being a gold digger, you know, because that's another stereotype that we encounter. And so one of the things to think about when couples present is how might their presenting issues and their presenting dynamics be influenced by this idea of stereotypes and feared perceptions or perceived perceptions of one member or the other within the relationship. And it's okay to ask about that stuff, and we'll talk about that a little more. But I think especially to be sensitive to that as therapists, it's really helpful to be able to put some language to it and put some words on it, because otherwise it's easy to interpret people's behavior and people's feelings as exclusively individual when really there's a lot of contextual aspects to them. So that's the first thing. Related to this, social value, or a related term is social location. Sociologists use that term seemingly. So social value or social location just refers to the relative, in a society, if there is indeed a hierarchical value or a way that certain groups are privileged over others, and there is, people are aware of that. And so when people get together and one member of a group is from one social location or from one group that has a higher social value than the other, again, this is a thing that exacerbates couples dynamics a lot. So I saw a couple last year sometime, and the guy was African American and the woman was Asian American, and they had a lot of conflict around sex, which was the presenting issue, but it was so much more than that. And one of the things that they talked about was meeting each other's families. So her family was in her country of origin in Asia, and I won't give details because I don't want anybody to be identifiable, and his family was here in the US. And we talked about how his family seemed, really open and happy to meet her, and, maybe a bit cautious, but not, she felt comfortable when she met them. And we talked about his experience by contrast of going to meet her family and feeling and knowing, because they talked about it and they were very open, feeling her family's hesitation and feeling her family's real need to get to know him and warm up to him and believe that he was going to be a good partner for their daughter. And I think this is something that in their case, it exacerbated a pattern that already existed where this guy, irrespective of being African American, tended to feel sort of unwanted, that people were not caring for him, or that he had to try really hard for affection. But on top of that, he has this very real sociocultural experience that almost reinforces it. And so that was one thing that we talked about really openly in therapy. So, have you guys talked about that, being African American, if you look at the survey results, fewer parents are excited to have you around than if you're another ethnicity. And they had talked about it, but I think a lot of couples haven't talked about it. And I think it can be very validating and healing to just say it out loud, and they can do whatever they want with it. But I think it's validating, especially to the partner with the lower social value, to just name that. And then again, it takes some of the dynamic out of the individual's psychology and their relationship style and puts it into a contextual space, as it justly should be. This is actually a really great video that BuzzFeed did. They analyzed data, or they reported on data analysis from a lot of different dating sites, and looked at the numbers and the percentages of people who got responses back from people they'd messaged across, I think it was like 3 big dating sites, based on the ethnicity and the gender of the person who had done the initiating. And they really differed a lot. And so I think I was really interested, saddened a little bit, but interesting to find this because it was just a couple years ago. And there were really stark differences in who answered who was perceived as attractive, who was perceived as a potential partner, and by which groups. So I really encourage you to go and have a look at that one too, because I think it really highlights this idea of social value. So intersections with sexual orientation. So again, there's not a lot of research out there on interracial couples and LGBT people, or anything besides straight married people. So this is going on some clinical experience and a little bit of research. So how does sexual orientation enter into interracial couples' experiences? So the first thing that I think of, and maybe the most common thing out there in the literature, is this idea of minority stress, and the idea of the more minority statuses you have, the more stressful that is. There's sort of a compounding effect of different aspects of your identity. More and more aspects of your identity that tend to be socially devalued, the more difficult it is. And so if you are in an interracial relationship already, it's visible. People have feelings about that. If you are lesbian or gay or bi or trans, you're again more visible. People have feelings about that. If you're a minority in this relationship, as we talked about, just previously, people have feelings about that. The stereotypes, the social value, all of that comes up. And so it can be, and I don't mean for it to sound like, oh, this is such a terrible thing, but as therapists, I think we have to be aware of the idea that the more devalued identities that people have, the more we might want to explore that and talk about that and see what their experience of that is like. Another thing that comes up is in an interracial relationship, potentially between the two partners, there may be very different cultural experiences of being gay, or cultural beliefs about being gay. So if you've got, I think maybe a stereotypical example, but one that comes up a lot is, if you've got someone who is from LA and they're white, and they're socioeconomically comfortable, and you've got a person from Omaha, not to pick on Omaha, I'll pick on my hometown, Lake Charles, Louisiana, and they're black, and they grew up in a very different environment in terms of acceptance or attitudes about being gay. These partners coming together could really have some stuff to negotiate about understanding how they're going to be in their relationship together, and different levels of difficulty with family dynamics and personal self-acceptance and things like that. So it's definitely the case that the cultural and racial experiences of the partners in question really can be quite different and really can influence people's experiences in their relationship. Excess scrutiny, I mean, this is one of those things about minority stress, but a lot of people say, a lot of interracial couples will say, you know, people stare at us. It depends on where you are, but people stare at you, and you can't tell what the looks mean, and sometimes they're nice, and sometimes they look really mean. And there's this idea of being visible and being different that's very socially uncomfortable for all of us as humans, but especially when you know that people might have an idea that what you're doing is transgressive, you feel on edge. And so there's an extra added layer of scrutiny and visibility for a couple who's LGBT, that is an extra added layer of scrutiny and wading through people's attitudes and things like that. Marginalization within LGBT communities. This is something that came up from a study, a qualitative study that I read. I'm not sure how prevalent or relevant this is in LA. I'd love to hear from people if you have ideas, but the idea that sometimes the LGBT community the face of it can seem white and middle class, and people who don't fit into that often feel or can feel that they don't necessarily fit in or they're not part of that community. Now this was 2003, and I don't know the extent to which that has changed or grown over time. Again, that's something we can talk about. And family response. So going along with the theme here of added stresses. This was a quote from an article, "Isn't it enough that you're a lesbian?" And this was from somebody's mom. "But now you're with a white woman, are you trying to kill me?" And so it's sort of dryly funny, but I think it does speak to, you know, families feeling like, oh my goodness, what else do I have to accept and adjust to, you know, about you. Intersections with gender and class and other identities. I'm not going to go into this in detail because it could be a really long conversation, but if you think again about the ways that people are stratified in terms of social value, in terms of power and resources allocated and things like that, you can see how being a man or being a woman or being of a higher social class or socioeconomic status or a lower social class definitely all interacts to create or impact someone's identity, and how any of these processes could also apply to gender or social class or ability or disability, things like that. So again, as clinicians, and we'll go into some specific clinical questions, but these are things to be keeping in mind and to ask about. Money. So this one's a sticky one, and I actually had a client just the other day that made me put this into the presentation because it wasn't there before. And so it went very deep. It went so much deeper than just money or entitlement or you know, splitting things along income lines. It was really impactful and meaningful to her, and I think it's something that we don't often talk about. And I think it has a lot of injustice and a lot of, you know, really difficult social stuff tied up in it, because it is true that different people have had different opportunities to accumulate wealth. It is true that people have had different, you know, educational opportunities that would lead them to, you know, the situation that they're in now. And there are stereotypes about racial groups and money and who handles money well and who wastes money, and things like that. And so money is something that I hadn't really thought of in terms of interracial relationships, but it might come up. You might.
How long was that relationship? I mean, 'cause that makes a difference too. Is it the beginning?
It was it's fairly
time?
new. Yeah,
It's
it's
newer?
several months in.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fairly new. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just share, my husband's Mexican, immigrated here, and
Uh-huh.
it's the opposite, so he really feels like he needs to be the caretaker,
Oh,
be the
yeah.
main provider, and I
Uh-huh.
have experienced, and we now, you know, obviously talk about it a lot, but I experience
Mhm.
discomfort when he wants to pay for everything, because I was raised in a family that as women we have our own money and we take care of ourselves. So I can see how it 100% comes up.
So interesting, yeah. And also the cultural piece there. That's
cultural.
Yes, definitely. Cultural and sort of
Even, you know, I hear that a lot from single guys, that they always feel they have to pay for everything. It's
right.
It's almost like the standard in LA. If you take out a girl, you gotta pay for everything.
Yes, exactly.
From the men's point of view.
From the men's point of view, right. And so from the men's perspective, it's like, well, this feels, you know, unjust. And it's I think it just highlights, not that anybody's right or wrong, but I think it highlights the different layers of understanding about that a couple might have to get to in order to be happy with their situation. And then, I don't know why I didn't make a bigger slide on this, but family response. I think this is a big deal for people. You know, people get into an interracial relationship, they finally iron out some of, you know, whatever issues they have, and they're like, okay, now's the time that we're gonna eventually meet each other's families. And this can be a source of a lot of anxiety and a lot of family either, you know, acceptance and people are fine, or sometimes not so much. I have so many stories of clients and friends who have decided to talk to their families about who they're dating, and the family members really had to get used to the idea, really a lot. And my own situation as well. And without going into tons of stories, I think as clinicians it can be helpful to help clients identify, to kind of break it up. Like, it's not the whole family that you're worried about, but who are you really most worried about? And what do you fear that their response is going to be? You know, what do you know about their attitudes? How can you envision this conversation going the best? You know, what do you and your partner have to talk about before you talk to your family? What boundaries do you need in place when you guys meet? You know, is it something where you're not going to go and meet them for the first time and stay all week? Like, maybe you're going to go meet them and, you know, have dinner and then leave the first time. What kind of conversations do you need to set up with your parents or grandparents? So I think we can really help clients by having some of those conversations and breaking it down a little bit so that it's not so scary.
Well, it's also generational.
It is generational, very much so. Yes, yes. Yeah.
I was in a similar situation. I was engaged to Sky, and I still had not met his family.
Really?
Yeah, and I finally decided, when he went to work one day, I was just gonna go over to his family's home.
Oh my goodness.
Because I had enough. And
That
so
makes
I
sense.
knocked on the door. They knew exactly who I was.
Uh-huh.
They let me in. They called him up. They, you know, they had him come home because they had a family business. They had him come over to the house. We all went into a small room with Oprah Winfrey's magazine on the table, and the, you know, Sports Center, you know, ESPN that the dad was watching. And they sat us down together and they said, "You're lovely, you're beautiful, I'm sure you have a lot of wonderful, great qualities about you, but we don't want this in our family." They said, "This is unacceptable, we don't want our other grandchildren thinking that this is going to be okay. If you want to go back to Hawaii or move someplace far and you guys move there together and he gives up his portion in the family business, you can do that and we'll never see him, and we don't want any half-breed grandchildren."
Oh my goodness!
But they
In
said
a
they
small
weren't,
room.
they weren't racist.
Oh my gosh!
We had what black people worked for us.
Theoretically.
And so he was crying, he was devastated.
That's what he was fearing.
He was broken. He didn't want to face that. And he said, "How could you say this? She's the salt of the earth. You don't know her." I mean, he was just belligerent. And I had to make the decision to say, as much as I think that you are an amazing human being, I could never marry someone with a family like that.
Right. Oh, seriously,
So,
that would have been so
I mean, if they
hard.
really tell you what it is,
Wow.
if you really wanted to know, I mean, and I date interracially most of my relationships, and if you ever, I mean, you know, I can say black people are way more accepting and our families are way more accepting. If you really wanted to hear what the white families had to say, you don't want to hear it.
And
So
especially
that's
that,
sickening and disgusting.
well, and his family, that level of sort of certainty that, you know,
Right.
this is how we feel and this is not going to change. There wasn't any tentativeness or any openness or willingness to, yeah,
Absolutely not.
that really does
Even
seem
though
at the
we like
extreme,
that.
right?
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
That is such,
sure.
I'm so sorry, that must have been awful. I can't even
For
imagine.
him, more or less. For him.
Yeah.
He's stuck with them. I'm not.
That's right. You could leave.
Yeah.
I'm skipping that last slide on purpose. So I want to be sure to get to the clinical tools in the end of our talk here. So to talk about some of the things that the research seemed to say was important and that in my experience has been helpful. We'll talk about this as our last piece. So the first clinical tool that I think is the most important probably is therapist self-awareness. And when I say that, I mean self-awareness about the attitudes and the feelings and the thoughts and the beliefs that we hold as human beings and as therapists about race, about interracial couples, about you know, all the things that we see in our offices. I think, you know, as good people and as helping professionals, it's easy to say, you know, I'm really accepting of everybody. I really want to help everybody who comes into my office. You know, I'm a humanist. I believe that everybody's a good person, and I'm choosing really not to see the race or the sexual orientation or whatever. I think it's a trap that traps us, because then we don't get to actually see the fullness of the experience of the people that we are seeing. So I really advocate against a colorblind or a universalist orientation. I say, you know, it's there. We all grew up in this society. We all have thoughts and beliefs and feelings about ourselves, our own ethnicities, other people and their ethnicities. And I think it's maybe more painful, but ultimately better to just admit those things to ourselves and explore them, and to have a clear sense of what we actually think. So when we're sitting in a room with an interracial couple and we feel a little bit uncomfortable, rather than sort of glossing over that or trying to push it away, we can recognize, okay, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. What am I thinking? What are my thoughts here? How could this potentially impact our therapy, and what am I uncomfortable about? And to be able to use that clinically rather than sort of like squashing it down clinically. That's always a work in progress, but I definitely think that's the most important piece. Respectful curiosity is another clinical tool, and this term comes from this really great book that I read as part of this on a qualitative study with interracial couples. So respectful curiosity is the idea that it's okay to ask. It's okay to ask explicitly about how race comes into play for interracial couples, and it's okay to not know already. So the idea of, and this is something that we do as therapists all the time, you know, what's that like for you? How do you think having grown up with a distant mom, you know, influences this? We know how to ask these questions. But if you substitute our usual with, you know, things that are more explicitly maybe about race or about interracial relationships, we might ask, you know, do you guys, with a couple, you know, how do you guys feel that race or culture is part of this dynamic that you're having? Does it feel relevant to you? And just ask and see. And I will say that it feels really awkward to bring it up, or to say, you know, I know that I'm a black therapist, you know, and I know that you guys are, you know, whatever they are, and you know, how does this impact you? Does it? I'm just curious. I ask this with all my clients, and just sit back and let them say what they say. And it feels a little bit like we're crossing a social boundary because we're not supposed to talk about these things. But in therapy, I think clients really welcome it. In this study, almost all of the couples that they interviewed said, even couples who said race doesn't really play a part of our relationship, there are couples who tend to sort of minimize the role of race in their relationship. Even those couples said they would be fine with a therapist asking about race in their relationship, and that it would be preferable to not talking about it or covering it up. And I can say from my own personal experience, I have a therapist. I love my therapist. But he's an older white guy. And in our first session, I went to him around anxiety. Anxiety, some of it around public speaking, some of it around other career issues. And in our very first session, I was describing my anxiety and how I tend to spin about things. And he asked, and I was going to bring it up, but he asked, and I was so grateful that he asked. He said, do you feel like race has anything to do with this for you? And I was like, oh my God, it was such a relief. He just asked the question. I said, yes, it does. And so, then we opened up that whole conversation. And I didn't have to sit there and wonder if he was going to be comfortable talking about it, or, whether I was going to have to find a good way to bring it up. He just asked. And I think, in my experience, and whenever I've brought it up with clients, it seems to go over really well. So I would say in therapy, we get to break that rule about not talking about race or not talking about difficult things like that. Adding race to the conversation. This is a bit more of this. One of the things that you might ask yourself, though, too, in terms of case conceptualization, is maybe asking a question about, how do I think that these clients, either backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, or racial differences might be playing a part in their interactions or in their presenting concerns. What do you conceptualize might be the case? And then that can sort of guide maybe what you look for, what you ask them. And the rest we just went over. Oh, no, actually, let me take a step back before I go from this slide. One of the things that I thought was really helpful, some guidelines from one of the studies that I read, was assessing how the partners, in addition to you asking, do you guys think, race plays a part in this? How do you think it might play out for you? Is assessing a bit more about how they think about it in their relationship. And this might be in a future slide, but there are basically, in his study anyway, that there came out sort of 3 categories of how couples tended to interact around difference in their relationship. One was that it didn't seem to matter to either party. One was that, one party felt that it was really important and the other party felt that it wasn't a big deal, and there was a real lack of understanding between the two. And then in the third category, they both felt that it was important and they both, were open to talking about it. So one thing might be, when you ask those questions, sort of see how both parties respond and if they tend to agree or disagree, and how that might be playing in. So again, how they negotiate difference and their narratives around race and racial relationships. I was talking, as I was preparing this talk, to my partner, and we were just talking about, I said, I can't remember how it came up, but, did you date black women before me? What was that like? When did you know that this was something that you could do? Because he said, he grew up in Tennessee, and he's a bit older than me, and you just couldn't do it, And so he told me stories of, a couple of other black women that he dated. And he said, and they were in Texas, I think, at that time. And he said, I definitely noticed that people looked at us, but, it wasn't a big deal. And I was like, you didn't think it was a big deal? I bet if I asked your date, it would have been a bigger deal, because social psych shows us that people who have less power tend to be way more vigilant and way more threatened, because they have to be, by expressions of disapproval or by people's looks or gestures. So the white partner always feels like it's not a big deal, but see if the other partner doesn't. I shouldn't say always. Frequently, if there's a difference, that's what it is. Okay. And then we just went over this, working with racial themes, respect for curiosity, and then the 3 different categories of couples that you might encounter. And of course, you can imagine how this, can impact how you work with them. If they're both in agreement, then you might, especially if they're both in agreement about race matters, then it's easy to have a conversation about this. If they're both in agreement that race doesn't matter, sometimes it really doesn't. Sometimes it's a protective mechanism against the discomfort of acknowledging, the extra added stuff that race brings in to the relationship. Sometimes they're testing the waters to see what we're gonna say. Sometimes it could be any number of things. But I would tend to say, I wouldn't tend to stop there. I would tend to gently explore and maybe bring up the question various times. Maybe not in the first session, but maybe various times throughout, and see if their response changes or if one person's response changes over time, and see if there really is something to talk about there. And then finally, specific tools and exercises that could be helpful. Using genograms, I mean, I know this is something that a lot of us might use as a tool, but bringing into it, you know, in your family, which of these people, did you ever talk about race in your family? You know, did anybody else in your family ever marry outside of their race or ever have relationships outside of their race? What does this look like in your family? And you can use a genogram for that. Some other sort of general couples stuff is helpful here. You know, what's your experience of your partner? How well do you think you know them? What would you have to do to understand your partner more fully? Defending your partner's experience, especially if there's disagreement around anything, but disagreement around race. You know, if you had to defend your partner's actions or beliefs or feelings, you know, to a jury, what would you say? And sort of get the partner to put themselves in the place of defending and explaining why their partner feels the way they do. If you're the type of person who likes like standardized questionnaires, there are some out there. The cultural assumptions and beliefs inventory is one, and it's basically a way to see how people's ideas or beliefs are about culture and how it impacts them in their relationship. And if the partner's views or scores are, you know, discrepant, then you know that there's more maybe to talk about. All right. And then finally, things clients report as unhelpful. And this is from things that I've read and also things that I've inadvertently done sometimes. So the first thing is that the presumption that relationship problems necessarily stem from the racial differences. So I think what I would say is that the racial differences always play a part, but they're not the core necessarily of the present. In fact, they're rarely the core of why something's wrong. And so it can feel pathologizing to people if we, you know, presume that the problems are all because of race and not anything because of anything else. Reluctance to talk about race for the reasons that we've talked about. Therapist guilt. I think this is one thing that a lot of us struggle with, you know, the guilt of privilege or the guilt of being, you know, an ethnicity that is more favored than others or something like that. We can tend to be maybe overprotective or oversighting with one partner. There was an example, I won't go into it, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. And then finally, related to that, romanticizing the relationship or one partner in it. Like, I've had people come up to me and my partner and say, and these are really, they were nice comments, but in a therapeutic context, I think it would feel a little patronizing. So I've had people come up to us and say, "You guys are the cutest couple. You guys are such a lovely couple." And it's a nice thing, and I take it as a compliment. But I know that there's a racial piece in there because we, you know, it's unusual to see us together. And so, you know, in a bar when people are drunk, I can totally take that with a grain of salt and be like, "Thank you, it's really nice of you." But in therapy, that's something that we would want to avoid, that kind of romanticizing or you know, a sort of making a to-do about, you know, the cultural complexities of our clients or whatever. And I know that you guys would not do that, but I thought it was interesting to read some of the accounts of that. Okay, so that is it. Oh, no. There's a summary. And I feel like we actually covered these really well, so I'm not going to go through these in detail because I want to leave time for discussion. So you can read these in your handout. And let's just move straight into Q&A and discussion because you guys have been really fantastic in holding comments. So we have 7 or 8 minutes. I'll open the floor to you. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
On communication, interpersonal communication, we already touched on that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering I often run into this problem with indirect communication, especially for Pacific Asians. There's this one partner's often very indirect.
Yes.
And then I have another partner who's very like, "Those are your needs, you need to communicate them to me, I take responsibility for this sort of like saving face, whatever it is."
Yes.
And there's all kinds of confusion around what that means, especially if the indirectness is coming from the male then it's somehow, anyway, so it's,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you ran into that, Eric, and if you had some chance to kind of help me with it.
Yeah, I have run into this, and you know, I've run into it with interracial couples, and I've run into it with just American male-female couples too. But you know, it's hard. I think it depends, because it seems like a lot of the problem sometimes is that one partner has needs that aren't getting met, but the other partner who's not meeting them doesn't feel like they're expressing their needs very well, and so the partner feels like they're left to guess, and if they guess wrong or if they don't intuit correctly, then they're penalized, and then there's this conflict. And so I guess one of the things I always think about is, you know, is that an accurate assessment? I mean, is the one partner really not communicating their needs, or is the other partner really sort of not trying hard enough to notice? So that's one thing, but then the other thing I often do is point out or ask about it. It seems like it's really hard for you, this partner, to communicate your needs directly. Tell me more about that, or how do you think, what do you think goes into that? Or I might even just say it explicitly. I did this with one of my just American male-female couples the other day who had a similar dynamic. I just said, you know, as women, we're often not encouraged to express our needs really directly, and there's a lot of indirect communication about that happens. Do you feel like that's part of this for you? And then talk about it. So I don't tend to label it first. I tend to sort of ask them first, but she wasn't getting it, so I just said it. So, but those are, and then using that to add some context to the situation and see what they do with that. But I don't know, sort of beyond that, I think couples will sort of take it. What have you done?
It's tricky, because I come from a very collective culture, so we can really romanticize the implicit.
Yeah.
I mean, but then at the same time, there's a piece in it I don't want to throw away, because it does have to do with sensuality and kind of a process, interpersonal. My experience when I first came here, this culture was very individualistic, and it felt very contractual initially. So I had to like tell my needs up front to my roommates. Here's I like my dishes this way, and I'm like, whoa, I didn't know.
Yeah.
We have a cup of coffee first. And so, but then we would label each other, and I would say, oh, you're so direct, that's terrible. And then, oh, you're so indirect, that's so Filipino, you know. So we were both projecting all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's hard to tease out what's cultural and what's appropriately healthy communication.
Right, right. Thank you. We have 5 minutes. Yeah, no, it's true, and what judgments get placed on that, and I think you're right, like how not to just throw it all out, throw out, whatever the way is that doesn't fit into the dominant cultural way that people do things, how to keep what's helpful and maybe acculturate a little bit in terms of communication style, and not even just acculturate to the relationship, and not have one person making all the changes and the other person just sort of sitting there and saying, well, you do it the way that I prefer. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I work with a couple, the gentleman is from Asian descent. This is exactly happening in the relationship. He's of Asian descent. Wife is American born, and that was really a problem with him. She felt like he was really passive and wasn't direct enough. And we just worked on like, well, how does he convey his messages? So helping her understand, so it wasn't about either one of them having to change, it wasn't him having to become more direct, her becoming less direct, but really looking at and understanding how the other one communicates. So she's able to recognize now when he does certain things or says certain things, that's what that means, and gaining more clarity on that. Because not forcing them to change who they are, but just understanding of each other.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
So I really like that, because I think as therapists we have our own culture, and we are all about encouraging people to express their feelings and get to it, and so we could err on the side of sort of aligning with the person who's more about direct expressing. So I love that you do that.
That's such a good point. We do all come in with our own culture and expectations and values about communication in particular. Yeah. Yeah.
What I often find, my first session always an in-depth intake and assessment of each, and it's always amazing that often people find out so much about each other that they never knew before.
In the intake,
And
yeah.
then they go home and they have so much to talk about, and so much came up that they had never even knew about each other.
Right, never even thought about.
Yeah,
That's
so
such a good
that's-
point. Yeah.
It always strikes me as interesting.
It is, like in an hour and a half or an
Right,
hour,
right,
right?
exactly,
More than
yeah.
years of being together. Yeah, so true. Maybe one more question, comment, anybody? We're good? Okay, well we're done. Thank you guys so much.